Welcome back. Today we're going to talk a little bit more about how fictional narratives work and how narrative in general works. And I thank you for putting up with my lengthy keynote address uh, that I showed you last week on the evolutionary foundations of storytelling. And what I wanted you to get from that is that telling stories is something that human beings do everywhere, and they've been doing it for much longer than we've been able to record the stories. Oral storytelling probably goes back 40 or 50,000 years in human history. And for most of that time, there were no writing systems. We lived in an oral culture. And in oral cultures, people tend to remember things longer because they aren't using so much of their cognitive apparatus for reading, for encoding and decoding texts. And they tend to use stories as a way to pass on important cultural memories and important cultural lessons. So early stories tend to fall into one of two categories, and we have some remnants of these kinds of categories right now, such as the story "The Shroud" that you read, I think, in last week's reading. This is a story by the Grimm brothers, and what they do, they were folklorists. They went out and they collected the stories of people in non-literate cultures, and they got a really good sense of the kinds of stories that people in those cultures told. And those stories tended to have life lessons. The Shroud is about not grieving the death of a child so intensely that you become incapable of functioning as a human being. In other words, it's a story that tells us that death is a normal part of life and that excessive grief is something that hurts us. And so that's a story, that's a message that people pass on from one generation to the next over hundreds and thousands of generations through this marvelous power of the story. The other kind of story that we get in pre-literate cultures is the epic, the cultural epic that tells the story of a hero. And the earliest written down stories that we have are stories that were oral probably many centuries before they were ever written down. Stories like the Iliad and the Odyssey in Greece, stories like Genesis, the Adam and Eve narrative, and Noah's Ark in the Hebrew Bible, or stories like Gilgamesh in the Babylonian culture. These are the earliest stories that we know about, and the written versions that we have show signs of having been oral narratives for many years earlier. So storytelling comes down to us in these two different ways. The myths of gods and heroes that tell a culture what is heroic and therefore what is important, and then the folk tales, the morality tales that convey messages. Little Red Riding Hood says, "Don't get off the path." Cinderella says, make sure that you have good shoes, or whatever it tells you. But those are the beginnings of what we call fiction. And since about the 19th century, we've had this thing called the short story. Novels actually developed before short stories. The short story is really a 19th century invention that takes an artistic tack on storytelling and creates fully self-contained narratives in sometimes just a few pages. Sometimes they can be longer, but really some of the best short stories, and the three we're reading for today are actually very short. Um, each of these stories plays in really important ways with point of view. And point of view in fiction is very similar to what it is in poetry. It's the character in the story who is telling you the story. And it can be, there are a number of different kinds of points of view, um, but almost all of them are either first person or third person. First person, the speaker uses I, and you're getting it from the perspective of somebody. And the third person, the speaker, is talking about them. The speaker, the teller of the story, is talking about other people. Now, within that, there's a lot of variation. For example, a first-person story can be from the perspective of the hero. like the Cask of Amontillado is, except he's not really the hero, he's the villain. Or it can be from the perspective of a minor character who's watching things unfold. This is, for example, The Great Gatsby isn't from the perspective of Gatsby, Jay Gatsby. It's from the perspective of Nick Carraway, who's a minor character. It can be something that's told in real time, or it can be something that's told as a reflected memory. But all of those at least give us a character in the story or in the novel that is the character that is speaking to us, and the first person narration is almost never going to be completely reliable. And let's look at a case of a very unreliable narrator, and that is Edgar Allan Poe's The Cask of Amontillado. And before you watch this video, you should watch the summary and analysis, the thug notes. I just thought that would be an interesting way to introduce the story. But as Mr. Thug Note says, it is often considered Poe's best short story and one of the best short stories ever written, because of the way that it uses the first-person narrative or the first-person perspective. So we start out and we get a narrator who is completely unreliable, and we know from the first sentence that this narrator is going to be unreliable, but just how unreliable is something that we still have to work out. The 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as best as I could, but when he ventured upon insult, I vowed revenge. You, who so well know the nature of my soul, will not suppose, however, that I gave utterance to a threat. At length I would be avenged. This was a point definitively settled, but the very definitiveness with which it was resolved precluded the idea of risk. I must not only punish, but punish with impunity. Okay, lots going on here. First of all, we're dealing with somebody who is going to seek revenge, and he's not going to seek revenge for anything specific, just 1,000 injuries and an insult. So somebody has been insulted, and he's going to get revenge, and we see sort of the elaborate calculations for this revenge, and we can sort of immediately recognize that this person is unhinged, that normal people don't go around plotting elaborate revenges for people for insults that they can't even define. So we have this narrator. We don't know his name yet. We know at some point we will learn that his name is Montresor, but we know the name of the person that he wants revenge on, and that is Fortunato, which means the fortunate one, or perhaps even fortune. So symbolically, we get the idea that the narrator perceives himself as unfortunate, and he perceives his enemy to be Fortunato, or fortune, or a fortunate person. And that gives us a dynamic that we actually can plug into something we already know, which is this is somebody who has not done well in life and perceives somebody else to be at fault simply because that other person is fortunate, and he's going to commit some ghastly deed. Knowing that this is Poe, we can probably suspect that it's going to be murder, which in fact that it is. So then we get the whole story through an unreliable narrative point of view, which means that we're not quite sure what we can trust. Some unreliable narrators tell stories so unreliable that we don't even know if they really happened. They could just be fantasies. Here, and this is also true in Poe's other very famous story, The Telltale Heart, we get what is probably a confession to a real murder, and we get the perspective of the murderer. We get to see how a murderer thinks, and it's meant to disturb us and unsettle us, and give us a certain amount of sympathy for a character that we know is doing something horrible. So what does he do? He approaches Fortunato at a carnival. And this is a place where there's lots of drinking going on, and Fortunato is dressed as a fool. Again, very symbolic. Fortune is dressed as a fool, in a motley and with bells on his head. And he tells him that he's got some great wine back in his back in his wine cellar. It's Amontillado, which is, in the terms of the story, is a very fine, very rare wine, and Fortunato is prides himself as being the greatest wine taster, the most sensitive wine drinker in the area. So he's appealing to his vanity to get him back into his caverns. Now, this also tells us something else that's not uninteresting, and that is that Montresor is not so down and out that he doesn't still have a castle and a big cellar and a lot of wine. So his sense that has been put upon, the sense that he's impoverished, well, he's not homeless. I mean, most people don't have huge cavernous wine cellars in their castle. So whatever poverty he feels, whatever misfortune he feels, is relative rather than absolute. Uh, then he continues to trap uh, Fortunato by appealing to his vanity to get him deep into the caverns in his home, and then he walls him up and leaves him to die. And this is gruesome. And you kind of, as it's unfolding, you start to understand the enormity of it. Um, this is somebody who feels that another person feels superior to him, which does appear to be the case, and wants to take him down a peg. Um, but we also, again, we get this all from Montresor's perspective, and what he tells us, he's very clear that Fortunato deserves to die, though he gives us absolutely no reason to suppose that this is the case. He doesn't tell us what it is that Fortunato did. Um, but he does show extremely elaborate planning and complete remorselessness. And these two things should really disturb us because normally we associate the kind of elaborate, careful planning that he's going through with something that is good, something that is commendable. But he's using this in order to not just take a life, but to take a life in a way that humiliates somebody, that uses that person's perceived strength against that person, and that settles scores that nobody else even knows are scores. So the pleasure of a story like this is entering into the mind of somebody completely alien, I hope, from us, and seeing how his mind works, and then watching the plans unfold, and then looking at some of the symbolism that's attached to this. One element of symbolism that's pretty important at the end, and it's also an element of deep irony, is the Masonic connection. Many people in Europe in the Renaissance through the Enlightenment periods were Masons. They were members of this fraternal order of people that traced themselves, at least conceptually, back to King Solomon's temple and the workers and the sort of the secrets that they knew. So the Masons were this group that presented itself as having secret wisdom and fraternity, brotherhood. And if one was a Mason, one should not harm another Mason. That was key. And many of our founding fathers were Masons. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, all belonged to Masonic lodges. And that's important because it was such an important network and such an important brotherhood that cut across traditional class lines for a long period of human history. But Mason also means brickworker, and the Masonic trowels are things that you actually use to lay bricks. So we have this thing at the end where we have these two senses of what it means to be a Mason, and that is that Fortunato makes a symbol that is associated with the Masons, and Montresor doesn't understand it. So what this means is that Montresor is not a member of the Masonic Brotherhood. Fortunato is trying to claim human compassion. He's trying to claim companionship by making this Masonic symbol. And he says, well, I guess you're not a Mason then. And then Montresor says, well, he said, I am a Mason. And then he proceeds to lay bricks, to be the other kind of Mason. So that's a point of irony where rather than human connection, we're getting somebody using Masonry to literally wall off somebody else. And that's part of the irony that makes the story enjoyable. But the whole package really depends on us reading a story from the perspective of somebody we can't trust and trying to figure out what actually happened. Now, that's a very different operation than we use in the Ernest Hemingway story, Hills Like White Elephants, which if you haven't watched yet, go to the module page and watch the dramatization of this, because it's a very, very short story, and the dramatization is extremely important. Now, in Ernest Hemingway's Hills Like White Elephants, we get a completely different perspective on the story. And the difference in perspective, once again, is more or less the point of the story. Poe is giving us complete access to the mind of an unreliable character. Hemingway, on the other hand, this is a third-person narrative, and it's a third-person narrative that does not enter into the minds of any characters. Let me explain that for a minute, because you have different kinds of third-person narratives. Sometimes you have a point of view character where the narrator is third person, but can tell you what at least one character is thinking or feeling, and can describe more than simply what that character says. Sometimes you have an omniscient narrator who can go in and out of the heads of all of the different characters and tell you what everybody is thinking. Tolstoy's War and Peace is the brilliant example of this. There's 500 characters in War and Peace, and Tolstoy seems to know what all of them are thinking. So he describes everything about their state of mind. Hemingway, on the other hand, in most of his work, and in this story particularly, tells you nothing about the character that an observer could not see for him or herself. So he is going to describe a conversation between two people. We have no idea what either one of them are thinking. We have no idea what has happened in their past. We know nothing that somebody sitting across the room from them and listening to their conversation would not know. So Hemingway describes them simply as an observer, as a completely limited perspective. So our job in the story, and what hopefully gives us enjoyment in the story, is trying to figure out what they're talking about, because we don't know, and the title doesn't really tell us what they're talking about. And if you watched it, you may, I think, be sensing that what this is about are two people, a man and a woman, who have been in a relationship, and one of them is pregnant, and the man is trying to convince the woman to have an abortion, and the woman is trying to convince the man to stay with her. And if you read it from that perspective, you see the interplay between them. They start out talking about the weather, even though they have much more important things to talk about. It's pretty hot. The man said, let's drink beer. Dos cervezas, the man said to the curtain. Big one. So the man speaks Spanish, and this is a Spanish-speaking country. That's something that you want to know. But of course, we know that because we know that they're in Spain. We can read that in the introduction. So they start drinking their beer, and the woman looks up at the hills and says, they look like white elephants. And the man says, I've never seen one, and drank his beer. So what you see here is the woman trying to engage the man in conversation, and the man refusing to be engaged in conversation. He wants to have a shallow conversation, just as he wanted to have a shallow relationship. And she says, no, you wouldn't have. I might have, the man said. Just because you say I wouldn't have doesn't prove anything. The girl looked at the bead curtain. They've painted something on it, she says. What does it say? Anís del Toro. It's a drink. Could we try it? And so he orders the Anís del Toro. So again, they're starting to fight over things that aren't important because they have this big controversy over something that is important. So they start bantering about the liquor that they're drinking, and you start to see their personalities emerge very, very briefly. The girl is more playful. She's imaginative. She wants to laugh and have fun, but she also wants an attachment to this man who has impregnated her. And the man, once they start talking about real things, he says, and this is line 42, "It's really an awfully simple operation, Jig," the man said. "It's not really an operation at all." The girl looked at the ground the table legs rested on. "I know you wouldn't mind it, Jig. It's really not anything. It's just to let the air in." The girl did not say anything. So this is where he's trying to explain, he's trying to talk her in to removing all responsibility from him by having an abortion and terminating their pregnancy. "Then what will we do afterwards?" she asks. "We'll be fine afterwards, just like we were before." "What makes you think so? That's the only thing that bothers us. It's the only thing that's made us unhappy." So now you're getting to the meat of what's happening. That they want completely different kinds of relationships, and he wants to eliminate anything that suggests commitment or long-term relationships. He just wants to have fun. Um, and he keeps talking. "I know we will. You don't have to be afraid. I've known lots of people that have done it." "So have I," said the girl. And afterwards they were all so happy. That's sarcasm. Hemingway doesn't tell us this. We have to work that out for ourselves. But that is sarcasm. And so they go on talking about, from the man's perspective, this is all that has to happen for the world to be perfect. And he basically even says that when they're talking. Um, "I said we could have everything. We can have everything. No, we can't. We can have the whole world. No, we can't. We can go everywhere. No, we can't. It isn't ours anymore. It's ours. No, it isn't. And once they take it away, you never get it back." So now she's talking about the baby. And she's got some emotions here that she's processing because she has an attachment to the child. She has an attachment to the man. And his view of having the whole world is never having responsibilities. So you get this going on, and I'm not going to read the whole thing because you can read it. It's very short and it's very clear, but also you have the dramatization. Um, but you have this conversation, and they never say what it's about. They never really acknowledge it because they know what it's about. We have to figure it out. But we start to see these characters emerge, one of whom is talking about the pregnancy as an obstacle to a good time, the other of whom is talking about the more profound emotions of terminating a pregnancy, and the relationship at the core that is a problem that she has, and she's clearly unwilling to simply be a plaything, but she also isn't perceiving that she has a lot of choice in the matter. But see, it's working all of that out that is the point of the story. It's working out what's happening from the words, and Hemingway is a master of this. He's a master of giving us just enough information for us to tell the story to ourselves. And when he does that, he makes us, in a very real way, a participant in the story. So that's the contrast you have between these two different ways of telling a story. And what I'm going to ask you to do in your bulletin board post today is go to the third story we're reading, which is Girl by Jamaica Kincaid, and talk about the point of view there. What point of view does Kincaid create for this story, and what then does this story mean when we look at it from that point of view, and how does the point of view reflect the meaning? So you'll have a short quiz today, and then you should go to the bulletin board post and talk about how the point of view creates meaning in Jamaica Kincaid's story, Girl. And also, have a great Thanksgiving. We will see you soon. Bye-bye.